In today's special compilation episode, we're going to look back at some of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries I've covered in the past, ranging from strange things caught on camera in the ocean, the woods, and even our very skies. From user accounts to cover-ups, this is simply an episode you won't want to miss. In 1894, a local farmer named Warren Cohen, who resided in Hillsboro, Ohio, was out fox hunting like any other day. With him were his trusty foxhounds, and Warren traveled on foot instead of horseback, which is more traditional with fox hunting. He trekked through dead underbrush and fallen branches. This was early spring, so the foliage had yet to grow. Immediately, his dogs stop and start acting strangely. They begin sniffing around frantically. Warren realizes his dogs caught the scent of a fox. Quickly, his dogs begin moving up an incline, following this trail. Warren followed his dogs up the incline, exhausted as he navigated the uneven terrain. The dogs were excited and happy, and they sniffed and pawed at the ground, but as they reached the crest of the hill, their behavior changed abruptly. The hounds went from eagerly running around, confident they'd found the trail of a fox, to one of anxiety. They circled an area of disturbed earth, and their noses began twitching nervously. Warren was very confused by this behavior because they never acted this way. He'd taken these foxhounds out here many times to hunt before, and they'd never acted like this. In confusion, he suspected this wasn't typical fox behavior. So what could this mystery be? As he drew closer, he noticed something unexpected about the ground. Strange and off-putting rectangular patterns were barely visible beneath a leaf litter and early spring grass. Warren knelt and brushed away the debris with his calloused hands. His fingers met something hard and smooth, too smooth to be a natural rock formation. This was strange. Eager to get to the bottom of what this was and why his dogs were acting strangely, Warren cleared more of the area. He squinted his eyes, and to Warren, this appeared to be a large slab of limestone. That's odd. Even stranger is that it was arranged in a bizarre pattern. He's thinking to himself, what in the world is this? His dogs were still acting nervous, whining and pacing around like they wanted to leave. Warren stood up, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. He knew he couldn't just leave this be. It was too strange, too important. But he also knew he couldn't do much more without proper tools. He looked around, trying to memorize exactly where this spot was. The old oak tree to the north, the oddly shaped boulder to the east, he'd use these as markers. However, after some thought, Warren knew what these were. As soon as the weather permitted, he'd return and take care of business. Well, within the coming days, the weather was permitting, and Warren gathered up all the tools necessary to do the job. This time, instead of bringing his foxhounds, he brought his tools and wits. Finding the markers he had memorized before, he quickly located the spot where these limestone slabs lay under the cold earth. Working quickly, he began digging, and it wasn't long before he realized there was more than one. Moreover, there was a series of these. He couldn't believe it. However, he felt watched during his excavation and the entire journey from his home to this location. He felt nervous. There was something off. It could be the atmosphere. Maybe it was the unknown. He started to pick up and understand why his dogs were acting off. Warren realized these limestone slabs followed a specific dimension, 2.5 to 3 feet long and a foot wide. Each of them was set a foot apart. There was something important under these slabs, and Warren was determined to uncover it. With a little effort and more time opening each slab, Warren realized something horrific. These were graves, each containing a skeleton with bizarre properties. Moreover, in these graves were tools like stone hatchets, beads, and even ornaments. Warren even found several large flint spears and arrowheads. However, he did not find them nested alongside the skeleton like you would in some cultures where they are buried with their possessions. These arrowheads were in the ribs and told him this was a warrior who had died in battle. Another skeleton was equally as strange as the first in one of the graves. Near the shoulders were several bizarre pipes and pendants. Warren realized the gravity of this discovery and it was featured in the New York Times. Folks, it only gets stranger from here, and I promise you there are more twists and turns. Going back 3 years to 1891, an American anthropologist and professor named Frederick Ward Putnam excavated one of the nearby burial mounds. In the same area, Warren made his discovery. Putnam came across a skeleton with bizarre features as well. Interestingly, he began to note that this skeleton had one unique characteristic other than its size: a double row of teeth. Putnam's excavation in the area continued, revealing several other skeletons that were not of typical size. These were not just larger than average, but towering at 7 feet or more, a size rarely seen in human remains. Going back to 1872, when one report appeared in the historical collections of Noble County, Ohio, described strange remains. Apparently, 3 skeletons measuring at least 8 feet in height were discovered in the same area. And guess what? They had something in common with what Mr. Putnam would discover some 19 years later. They had double rows of teeth. Folks, these are not outliers. At least 17 reports in Smithsonian ethnology reports of similar outsized skeletons over 7 feet in mounds found in this area. But what does all this mean? Well, here's where we get into the plot twist. The area in question is famously known by its nickname, the Serpent Mound, and it is located in rural Adams County, Ohio, sitting on a plateau overlooking Brush Creek. However, it's not that this mound resembles a snake that spans nearly 1,400 feet, it's the mystery itself that is so baffling. You see, this is known as an effigy mound, a specific kind that is created in the shape of an animal. Even more bizarre is that we know very little about it, no more than we did when it was first excavated in the 1800s. Some legends talk about this mound and the surrounding area possessing powerful supernatural energy. While we can't verify supernatural energy, we can document gravitational and magnetic anomalies that do occur in this area. This leads us to suspect that the construction of this mound was placed here intentionally. It's getting wilder. There have been long-standing stories of strange weather patterns and anomalous lights all around this mound. More so, there have been a plethora of strange UFO sightings and other weirdness that have gone on. Could this have anything to do with it being constructed along the impact crater of an ancient meteor strike? The prevailing belief is that the mound was built between 500 BC and 200 AD by the early woodland Adena culture. While the mound itself wasn't a burial site, the smaller mounds in the area were. Here's the twist. The remains discovered weren't your typical human skeletons. Their unusual nature has sparked speculation that a race of giants once inhabited this area alongside the natives. Unfortunately, there's so little information on the history of the Serpent Mound and the surrounding region that we can only speculate based on what has been found. The Serpent Mound and all the anomalies and discoveries connected to this area remain a mystery. Our next segment takes us to the Midwest, where over the years, there has been an increase in upright canine sightings. Yeah, it's as terrifying as it sounds, and no, these aren't creepypasta or horror fiction. These are all alleged stories shared by eyewitnesses themselves. A great example comes from the late Linda Godfrey, rest in peace, her 2006 book, Hunting the American Werewolf. And just 150 miles from Big Rapids, southwest across Lake Michigan, sits North Chicago, Illinois. A suburb of its own namesake, this town is home to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center. And despite being so close to one of America's largest cities, the center is actually surrounded by a lot of woods. Now, this is partially due to the fact that the facility is extremely close to Lake Michigan, meaning that a lot of the shoreline has been preserved. Today, you'll find tons of patches of woodland in this area. Not any real vast wilderness, mind you, but plenty of space for something to roam free and remain hidden. And it was from one of these patches of forest that something horrific appeared in the early 1990s. Over the course of her career as a writer, Linda Godfrey became known as one of the foremost experts in the world on werewolves and dogmen. And because of this, she often received letters from eyewitnesses sharing their own encounters with half-human, half-canine monsters. One of these experiencers was a woman named Emma. You see, Emma was a former member of the United States Navy and, in '94, was stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in North Chicago. And so as part of her assignment, Emma served in a capacity similar to Gary in our last story. She was an overnight guard, and most of the time she patrolled the naval hospital grounds at the center, a route that often took her past the nearby old naval hospital graveyard. That's pretty creepy, isn't it? Emma says that she and her fellow sailors liked to play pranks on each other. One of their favorite things to do was to capitalize on how their shore patrol route took them by the old boneyard. From here, they would make weird noises at each other, hide and jump out at the last second, or more often, leave a radio among the tombstones. But on the one evening in September, what she encountered was no prank. She was sure of that. Now that night, Emma was one of two other personnel patrolling the hospital grounds. Her partners were Jim and John. Gee, how original. Emma says that on the night of her sighting, she was walking along one of the property's wooded trails that kind of skirts the shores of Lake Michigan, and John was closer to the lake on the other side of the breakers, while Jim had taken up guard duty near the hospital itself. And at some point, Emma radios to John just to give him a hard time. You see, the two of them are dating, and while they would later get married, they're still in the early stages of their relationship. And Emma wants to bust his chops a little, like flirtatious couples often do. And normally, John would have given it right back to her, but something unusual happens. When Emma makes her sarcastic comments over the radio, all she gets back is silence. I guess you could say radio silence. They do this sort of thing all the time. And in fact, the only way to pass the long nights during guard duty is to keep things lively with chatter and the occasional prank. Now tonight, Emma and John have been especially chatty, but by 3 a.m, he isn't responding to any of her messages. He has ghosted her. Again, no pun intended, with the graveyard and all that. That's when it dawns on her. That son of a gun, he's gonna play a trick on me at the graveyard, isn't he? Knowing that this is the most likely scenario, Emma doesn't head to the graveyard, but instead takes a detour off the wooded path to the other side of the breakers, where John is supposed to be. Now, she sees her future husband and calls out to him, but John just stands there. And by now, Emma's confused. It's not a prank at all. John just isn't playing around. When she gets closer, she can see that he is shaking, and he's staring past the breakers into the woods. Now, Emma describes John as a 6'3" strapping Navajo and says that she has rarely seen him afraid, but that night in September of '94, he was absolutely terrified. Carefully, Emma walks up behind John, the beam of her flashlight splashing against his back. Then, slowly and cautiously, she reaches out and touches him. He doesn't react. He's focused on the woods, his mouth hanging wide open. Now that she is touching him, Emma can tell that he is shaking even worse than she had thought. Emma wrote this.
Now, having been raised in a Jersey Pines, I figured it may have been a little black bear or a raccoon he was seeing. I called him a rude word, as fellow shipmates often do, and shined my mag light in the woods. I will never forget what I saw. It was tall. How tall, I'm not a good judge, but it was taller than John. It had an odd head, like a big man, with a dog-like head. I've tried to rationalize what we saw. It was not a bear, as so many people try to tell me, as I've encountered them many times before.
Emma said that her initial reaction to this figure in the woods was that it reminded her not of a werewolf, but instead the Egyptian god of the dead, Anubis. Anubis is a psychopomp, a god tasked with leading human souls to the afterlife, and is famously depicted just as she described, as a human being with the head of a jackal. And so Emma is staring at this creature, unsure of what to do. The only thing she can think of is that There's safety in numbers, so she calls into her radio for Jim to join them to get himself over to their position ASAP. Emma said that the entire time, John keeps mumbling the same word over and over, and he keeps saying skinwalker.
Skinwalker.
Skinwalker. Skinwalker.
Now, in the time that it takes Jim to arrive on the scene, Emma and John have plenty of time to watch this thing on the edge of the forest. She went on to say this:
I had never heard of anything like that before, and I was just freaked at what I was seeing. The thing didn't seem too upset by us being there. It just stood there with its long arms. I couldn't see the hands, and it had big greeny yellow eyes. It was just weird.
Finally, Jim bursts through the woods himself. He doesn't know why he's been called, only that Emma sounded like it was urgent. Well, the moment that their fellow sailor appears, Emma said that the creature kind of puffs up, kind of like a cat, and takes off, but more upright than on all fours. The sudden movement catches Jim's attention. While he doesn't get a good of a look at the thing as the couple does, he still clearly sees its back as it dissolves into the forest. And that was it. They never saw the creature again, and Emma concluded her story by describing the fallout from their encounter, which, after managing to calm down John, all three of them reported. When they ended their shift, they recorded their sighting in the logbook. Emma said this:
All three of us suffered weeks of harassment over it. After we both ended our enlistment, John and I moved to his hometown of Farmington, New Mexico. His grandma enlightened me to what a skinwalker is, even though I'm still not sure as to what we saw. John has always been adamant, though. He swears it was a skinwalker. Jim, we lost contact with, so I can't say if it still bothers him. As for me, I would just like to know what the hell it was we saw that night, and why the hair on my arm still stands up when I think about it. This has bothered me for some time, and after reading Linda's interviews about other encounters, I have to say I don't feel nearly as nuts about it now. If anyone can provide a rational explanation for what we saw, it would be much appreciated. For this is one event I would really like to explain.
Coming off the tails, no pun intended, of that last segment, the Amarillo Zoo in Texas caught something strange on camera they couldn't believe. I mean, sure, it could totally be fake, but what's strange is that even the zoo themselves publicly declared that it wasn't a hoax. This was something genuinely abnormal caught on camera. What do you think? On the morning of May 21st, 2022, the staff at Amarillo Zoo in Texas arrived for their usual day of work. But little did they know that they were about to stumble upon something that would capture the imagination of the entire town and beyond. As part of their routine, the zoo employees began reviewing the previous night's security camera footage. It was around 1:25 in the morning when they noticed something peculiar. There, on the grainy black and white screen, was a figure unlike anything they'd seen before. The creature, if you could call it that, appeared to be bipedal, standing upright like a person. But the shape was all wrong. It had a strange, elongated head that almost looked like it was wearing an unusual hat. Its body was thin and lanky, with proportions that didn't quite match any known animal or person. Interestingly, the zoo's cameras were set up to only capture still images when they detected motion. This meant that instead of a video showing how this mysterious figure moved, they were left with a single, eerie snapshot frozen in time. The staff were baffled. Was this some kind of prank? A person in a costume? Or could it be something more unexplainable? They knew they had to get a second opinion. The zoo's staff quickly brought the image to the attention of Michael Kashuba, the director of Parks and Recreation for the city of Amarillo. Kashuba's initial reaction was one of intrigue and excitement. I mean, he recognized immediately that this wasn't just an ordinary night at the zoo. Kashuba, knowing the potential interest this image could generate, made a bold decision. Instead of keeping the mysterious figure under wraps, he decided to share it with the public. On the zoo's social media accounts, they posted the grainy image along with a playful caption dubbing the figure a UAO, an unidentified Amarillo object. The post read, "The Amarillo Zoo captured a strange image outside the zoo in the dark and early morning hours of May 21st around 1:25 a.m. Is it a person with a strange hat who likes to walk at night? A chupacabra? Do you have any ideas of what this UAO could be?" What's interesting is that Kashuba and the zoo staff weren't just sharing the image for fun. They genuinely wanted input from the community. In an interview with News Channel 10, he explained, "We'd love to hear feedback from the community on what they think it might be."
Officials want the public's help in figuring out what the heck this is. Caught in a security camera photo, a bizarre figure is seen walking outside the Amarillo Zoo. City authorities say the image is real and they're baffled, so they're now asking for public input on social media.
Anticipating skepticism, Kashuba made a point to address the authenticity of the image, and he stated firmly that the photo is absolutely real. Now, this declaration was crucial as it set the stage for what was about to unfold. A wave of speculation and theories that would sweep across not just Amarillo, but the entire internet. And as the image began to circulate more, it quickly caught fire on most social media platforms. What had started as a local curiosity was now rapidly becoming a nationwide phenomenon. People from all walks of life were chiming in with their theories about what this strange figure could be. And the range of suggestions was as diverse as it was entertaining. Some took a more lighthearted approach to the mystery. One user on X, formerly known as Twitter, confidently declared that the figure was none other than Rocket, the wisecracking raccoon from the popular Guardians of the Galaxy. It was a humorous take, but one that highlighted just how unusual and out of place the creature in the image appeared. Others leaned into more traditional cryptozoological explanations. Sasquatch, the legendary creature of North American folklore, was the most popular guess. It wasn't hard to see why. The figure's upright stance and seemingly furry appearance did bear some resemblance to descriptions of the elusive Bigfoot. Perhaps the most intriguing theory came from those who believed in the supernatural. One user wrote, "Clearly a skinwalker phasing between two densities or dimensions, and what a better place but the zoo." Interestingly, some observers drew parallels to popular fiction. One commenter noted a resemblance to the werewolf from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, highlighting how this thing's appearance seemed to straddle the line between reality and fantasy. Some members of the public began to demand more evidence. One user urged the zoo to release video footage of the creature, hoping to see how it moved. However, the zoo had to disappoint them, explaining this image was taken from a camera that only shoots a still image when it detects motion. This limitation only added to the intrigue, leaving the creature's true nature even more open to interpretation. What's noteworthy about this incident is how it just completely captivated people's imaginations for the time it did. Even nearly 2 years after the sighting, as of early 2024, the true identity of the Amarillo Zoo creature remains a mystery. Our next segment takes us down under and into the skies in what is easily one of the strangest mysteries and disappearances in the last 100 years. Frederick Valentich, or Valentich, was a pilot who vanished without a trace, but what's stranger are the circumstances surrounding him and the surreptitious actions of the military and government. On June 9th, 1958, Frederick Valentich was born in Avondale Heights, a suburb of Melbourne, Australia. While he was born into a loving family, Fred was just your average kid growing up in the suburbs. But there was one thing that set him apart: his burning desire to soar through the skies. From a young age, all Fred could think about was becoming a pilot. It was his dream, his passion, his everything. But despite his dreams of becoming an aviator, Fred experienced several setbacks. He eventually obtained a Class 4 instrument rating at the age of 20, allowing him to fly at night. But experienced a lot of difficulty in trying to further his career. Twice, Fred had applied to join the Royal Australian Air Force, and twice he'd been denied, but not on the basis of his competency. They rejected him on lacking adequate educational qualifications. But despite these setbacks, Fred persevered. He spent as much time as he could working towards his goal of becoming a full-time airman. But he also failed these tests as well. It seems like Fred had a reputation for being reckless, relying on his instinct rather than his training. One time, a plane that he was flying strayed into controlled airspace above Sydney. Another time, twice actually, he deliberately flew into a cloud despite being warned not to. The end result was that he was denied a commercial license on 5 separate occasions, all because of this record. Well, folks, things are about to get dark, and let me tell you, there is a heck of a plot twist coming. On Saturday, October 21st, 1978, Fred took off in a Cessna 182L light aircraft at exactly 6:19 in the evening from Moorabbin Airport. His destination was a spot north of Tasmania known as King Island, a journey which would take him over the Bass Strait. Basically, Fred had 2 reasons for the trip. The first was that he was hoping to log more night flying time. As of his departure, Fred was only allowed to fly at night in visual meteorological conditions, or when the weather was clear, and if he ever hoped to advance his career, he'd need more experience flying when it was dark. The other reason that Fred was traveling to King Island shows the kind of person he was. At the time, Fred served as an instructor with the Air Training Corps and wanted to give his fellow aviators a treat. His plan was to pick up some crayfish from King Island for everyone to enjoy. And some later reports claim that Fred also mentioned seeing some friends while on this short trip. And so Fred set off into the night, everything going smoothly for the time being. And around 40 minutes into his flight, he passes over the lighthouse at Cape Otway, but then something strange happened. At 7:06 p.m., Fred radios the flight service unit and says, "Pilot to ground, is there any known traffic in my area below 5,000 feet? And the FSU responded, "Negative, no known traffic." Three minutes goes by without any further contact. Ground crew at the flight service unit called in to try and clarify what he said, asking him to describe the aircraft. And now he had told ground control that the craft was nowhere to be seen. And the technicians on the ground repeated his statement. They radioed, "Confirm it has vanished." And Fred answered, "Affirmative, do you know what sort of aircraft I've got? Is it military?" And the flight service unit denied the presence of any military aircraft in the area. But just when it seemed like the worst was over, Fred issued another message. At 7:12 p.m., 6 minutes after initially spotting the strange object in the sky over the Bass Strait, Fred said, "The engine is rough and idling. I've got it set in." The ground crew responded with Fred's call sign, "Delta Sierra Juliet Roger, what are your intentions?" Fred responded like the young professional he was. But something interrupted his explanation. The last words that Frederick Valentich ever spoke was his call sign, Delta Sierra. And then this, 7 of the weirdest seconds of UFO audio ever recorded. Listen to it again. What do you hear? It sounds like a crash or some sort of bizarre clattering sound. The radio went silent. Ground control eagerly awaited his arrival at King Island, hoping that just his communications had gone haywire. But his scheduled arrival time of 7:28 p.m. came and went with no signs of Valentich. Disturbingly, while the replies from the flight service unit on the ground were recorded in official transcripts, they were erased in the recordings of Fred's flight. Now, this seems really unusual, doesn't it? It might not mean anything, but if there was a conspiracy to cover up Fred's fate, is it possible that the transcription of the conversation could have been fraudulent? Immediately after, a search was mounted. 8 civilian aircraft were enlisted in the search. The military even got involved. Right away, the Royal Australian Air Force dispatched the Orion, a long-range maritime reconnaissance aircraft from South Australia. It followed the exact same flight path that Fred had flown, but found nothing. The only thing even remotely suggesting that a crash had occurred was an oil slick that appeared on Sunday near King Island, which was 18 miles to the north. But there was no debris. Everyone was excited when some material was recovered, but this turned out just to be plastic bags and packing cases. And out of the 1,000 square miles that was searched from the air, it yielded no results. The search was called off 4 days later. Clearly, something happened to Frederick Valentich in October of 1978. But what exactly? It wasn't until July of 1983 that there was an actual break in the Valentich case. While not conclusive, the Bureau of Air Safety Investigation revealed that a piece of debris was found by the Royal Australian Navy Research Laboratory. The material was part of a cowl flap found on the shore of Flinders Island on the eastern border of the Bass Strait. Not only did it belong to a Cessna 182, but the serial numbers fell within a range that would have included Fred's airplane. As it turns out, the official documentation was vague about Fred's fate. In May of 1982, the Bureau of Air Safety Investigation, acting on behalf of the Australian Department of Aviation, released a file on their investigation into the events of October 21, 1978. Their findings? Location of occurrence not known. Time not known. Degree of injury presumed fatal. Opinion as to cause. The reason for the disappearance of the aircraft has not been determined. In short, the investigation determined diddly squat. But here's where things get weird. Basically, the main researcher leading the investigation into the Valentich disappearance was longtime ufologist Bill Chalker, and this report didn't sit well with him. So Bill followed up with the Secretary of Air Safety Investigation at the Department of Aviation, a man by the name of G.V. Hughes, and Hughes told Bill this.
The Royal Australian Air Force is responsible for the investigation of reports concerning UFO sightings, and liaison was established with the RAAF on these aspects of the investigation. Now, the decision as to whether or not the UFO report is being investigated rests with the RAAF and not with this department.
Okay, clear enough, right? The Royal Australian Air Force is the group in charge, so Bill, being a good and thorough investigator, reaches out to the RAAF, and this is what he said he found out.
During 1982, over 4 separate visits totaling 6 days, I was able to examine what was ostensibly the entirety of the official UFO files held by the Directorate of Air Force Intelligence. There was no extant documentation on the Valentich incident in the RAAF files I examined. It was explained to me that the RAAF did not investigate the affair because they were not asked to by the Department of Aviation.
Meaning that, in other words, the Valentich disappearance had become something of a hot potato. Nobody wanted to touch it. The Department of Aviation said, go ask the RAAF, while the RAAF said, go ask the Department of Aviation. So what about the crazy sound at the end of his transmission? Maybe it was the sound of the craft interfering with Fred's radio, or maybe the microphone even picked up a collision. Well, extensive analysis has been conducted on this 6 to 7 second noise that happens at the end of the audio recording. Most of it was carried out by Dr. Richard Haynes, a scientist with a deep interest in the UFO phenomenon. In the early 1980s, he concluded this.
In the metallic noises, containing 36 separate bursts with fairly constant start and stop pulses, bounding each one, there are no discernible patterns in time or frequency to these bursts. Dr. Haynes concluded that the effect was similar to that produced by rapid keying of the microphone, but he points out that control tests using the same technique were noticeably different from the original sound.
The identity of the sound remains a mystery, but whatever it captured, it seemed to cause Frederick Valentich's airplane to crash into the Bass Strait. Or is what we heard literally the sound of the UFO colliding with his Cessna, which has been an idea that's been supported in an issue of the Journal for Scientific Exploration from the year 2000. Either way, it seems that one of the two things is happening, either simple government incompetence or a government cover-up. I mean, there would be plenty of reasons to keep Fred's disappearance a secret. He did allude to somehow reading secret files, and if he really did encounter a UFO that night, then it would be in the Australian government's best interest to keep the exact details of the incident under wraps. But there's more twists and turns to this story, which brings us to an interesting part. Was Frederick Valentich the victim of UFO interference? Well, his father certainly seemed to think so, at least at one point or another. He went on the record several times confessing that he suspected his own son had been borrowed by visitors from another planet. In other words, he was abducted. But it's important to remember that his father was being swamped with calls from ufologists in the first few years after Fred vanished, and all of them were eager to make this into a UFO case. However, maybe there is some truth to this. What's equally interesting is after talking to Fred's father, he confirmed to Bill that his son was a believer in UFOs, and because of a previous sighting his son had, Fred, is where the interest started. In fact, about 8 to 10 months before Fred's disappearance, he claimed that he saw a brightly lit object off in the western sky that flew at tremendous speeds from south to north. However, what's really interesting is that his son had apparently been allowed to read some sort of secret UFO file, as vague and ambiguous as that is. What's really strange to me is that Fred encountering a UFO in this region isn't exactly isolated. And as it turns out, this period in the fall of 1978 was filled with UFO sightings. To the north, several hundred military personnel saw an enormous unidentified flying object just days before Fred's disappearance. The object was said to have covered half the sky and was close to the ground as it shined a pair of searchlights and then left without a trace. What's even more bizarre is that the immediate vicinity where Fred disappeared became a hot spot around the time that he vanished. Remember how Fred reported the UFO just after passing Cape Otway? Well, a civilian UFO organization claimed to have obtained photographs taken by a plumber, Roy Manifold, and it shows an object exiting the water at a rapid speed. The location, right by the Cape Otway Lighthouse. The most widely circulated picture supposedly shows an object leaving the Bass Strait in a blast of cloudy smoke. Here's another plot twist for you. The day was October 21st, 1978, the same day that Frederick Valentich vanished without a trace, and even more crazy is the fact that by some estimates, there were up to 15 sightings on that day, all of which remain unexplained. There were also extensive sightings in the months leading up to his disappearance. In his write-up on the Valentich disappearance and Ronald D. Stories, Mammoth Encyclopedia of Extraterrestrial Encounters, Bill Chalker wrote this.
During a 2-month period centered around January 1978, vacationers, fishermen, school teachers, local police, and lighthouse keepers in the Cape Otway area saw UFOs. Even earlier, during July 1977, local residents and the lighthouse keeper at Cape Otway saw an inexplicable brilliant light source that hovered out to sea for half an hour.
Bill went on to describe even more recent UFO sightings in and around the Bass Strait in more recent years. Now, additionally, in a research paper, Richard F. Haynes and Paul Norman both found 3 new eyewitnesses to the Valentich disappearance. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, all 3 of them described being in the vicinity of Cape Otway and seeing the exact same thing. An airplane descending downward at a steep angle with a much larger object with green lights flying just above it. So here we have this pilot and we have this strange transmission, coupled with the fact that this potentially could be a government or military cover-up, because it deals with UFOs and there seems to be a plethora of various eyewitness sightings of strange, unidentified craft in and around the area. But what does all of this mean? It's agreed upon by the majority of people that he simply did not run out of fuel. In fact, all aviation experts agreed that the Cessna had a full tank of fuel, which meant he could have flown another 500 miles without having to stop. So did that mean he simply broke communication? After all, it's been claimed that Fred's airplane never did show up on the radar, even when he was in communication with ground control. What would cause that? Because this is flat out weird. In conjunction with that, there are even stranger reports of a small aircraft landing near Cape Otway that same night. So what gives? Is it possible he was running away from his life and starting anew? While it's always plausible, it doesn't seem probable. In fact, interviews with Fred's friends and doctors all explain that he was very content and happy with his life. And so it just wouldn't make sense for him to up and abandon everything. So then, how else do we explain all of these bizarre circumstances? Well, maybe he was just a terrible pilot, and as a matter of fact, just look at the number of times he failed the various aviation tests. Not to mention, his track record was a bit on the reckless side. Is it possible he was simply a victim of his own errors? Well, for a lot of people, the most widely accepted possibility is that Fred was simply disoriented. They say that he was upside down, mistaking a reflection for the craft above him, maybe even the lights from his own airplane. What do you guys think about that? Maybe in a state of disorientation, false visual references led Fred to misidentifying the horizon and would accidentally force his plane into a death spiral that would ultimately cause engine failure and would send him crashing beneath the waves. But if that was the case, then how do you explain the strange aircraft hovering above Fred's plane? Well, it was suggested that it was just a star like Venus or Mercury. However, given his background as a pilot, do you really think that he would have made that misidentification? Interestingly, right before he died, Fred was talking to somebody over the radio, a ground control technician by the name of Steve Roby. Now, it wasn't until December 9th of 1980 that Steve would speak with the Melbourne Herald about his conversation with Fred, because at the time, the disorientation theory was very popular, and all he had to say about it was this.
Towards the end, I think he was definitely concerned for his safety. I considered that he would have had to have been a good actor to have put it all together the way he did. It was though he was looking around for this thing as he was speaking on the radio. It was kind of a rushed communication. It was as if he was startled. You can tell he was concerned. He put up his call sign before Melbourne. He was a little mixed up.
So, if that was the case, then what's going on? Well, there's still more to the story I haven't told you. In the immediate aftermath of Fred's disappearance, a number of people stepped up claiming that they had the answers, many of whom were psychics. One claimed to have contacted Fred in place of a bright light where he was no longer physical, meaning he didn't have a body, meaning he was dead. Interestingly, this psychic also claimed that Fred's spirit said that the Australian government had deliberately withheld a full minute of the audio recording from the public. He then revised his claims a month later, asserting that Fred had been taken deep within the hollow earth. However, in August of 1979, a bizarre prediction by Burley Smith made the news with Sydney's Daily Mirror.
He's alive. Missing pilot. Frederick Valentich will return before Christmas, in a different form. When Frederick returns, it will be to a shelly beach on an island. He will give the world an intricate description of what he saw.
That's a pretty bold claim. Unfortunately for her, her prediction was wrong. But here's the plot twist that's gonna blow your mind. The January 2002 issue of the Mutual UFO Network Journal features an editor's note that mentions how a shocking discovery was made by a Spanish researcher of the name of Manuel Carballal, and that there have been multiple eyewitness testimonies who have all claimed to have seen a strange man residing on the island of Tenerife in the Canary Islands, specifically at the Plaza del Charco, which is a seaport square. Can you guess the identity of this man? None other than Frederick Valentich, the Australian pilot who vanished mysteriously in 1978, was seen alive and well in 1990. Apparently, this man identified himself as so and even had an Australian passport to prove his claim. But what's really bizarre is that he told all the people he spoke with on multiple occasions that he now belonged to a group of humans who had been recruited by extraterrestrials. What's also bizarre is that he had no signs of aging and perfectly resembled the photos that had circulated around the time of his disappearance, which means he still looked about 21 years old. Wait a minute, I thought you said that the 1979 prediction was wrong. Well, it was, but only partially. Her prediction of him returning was accurate. She just got the date wrong. But what about the holes in the story that we haven't addressed? There are many people that have pointed out that Fred probably wouldn't have had his passport with him the night he vanished, which is true. Not to mention that if a passport is issued in 1978, it more than likely would have expired by 1990. So there is a lot of bizarre circumstances surrounding this. Was Frederick Valentich a bad pilot, as the official narrative goes, or did he simply know too much? Was there something he learned that the authorities wanted to cover up that had them doing everything they could to keep him from having an active career in aviation? Or was he truly taken like he claimed and brought back to a different time period? Now, let me ask you one last question. If it really was him, is he just content living out the rest of his life on this island and not making contact with his family and the rest of the world? This next bit is where we shift gears a bit. Instead of terrifying, this next one is one of sadness, and I'm not gonna lie, definitely pulled on my heartstrings quite a bit, being a father myself. Grab a box of tissues if you got them close to you, because no, this doesn't have a happy ending. Back in 1920, Joseph Amarillo Singh found himself bushwhacking through some of the densest and thickest jungles in India. Joseph was traveling along with 30 other men as he traversed and faced the dangers of the jungle, all in order to do one task: spread the gospel of Jesus. Having just been ordained 8 years earlier, his mission was to visit the region's most isolated communities, even through some of the most dangerous areas. Keep in mind that the jungles in India are extremely untamed and there is danger lurking around every corner. And as a matter of fact, in this party of 30 men, some of them were drummers, and their sole purpose was to try and make noise and keep dangerous animals away, mainly those big Bengal tigers. Now, it was during this time that him and his party would make their way all around West Bengal. And then, in 1920, things take place. At this point, they had found themselves in the jungles around Midnapore while looking for newer communities to evangelize. And it was here they traveled to a very small border town known as Godamuri. And it was here that Joseph encountered a man named Chunarem that was kind enough to allow him and his missionaries to take refuge in his own cowshed. However, while his warmth and hospitality were wonderful, he had a shocking story to tell them. He explained to Joseph and his party that he and the other villagers had been terrified to traverse the jungles after sunset. Joseph did his best to press for details and to find out why he was so terrified. Maybe it was because of tigers, maybe it was because of other unseen predators lurking about the jungle. But what he told them was something Joseph was not expecting. Chunarem described in detail this thing in the jungle that was hideous, a supernatural predator of some kind. It could be seen at dusk, and that about 7 miles away from the village was where it dwelt. He then begged Joseph and his party to please get rid of this thing. Well, fast forward a couple of days, and around September 24th at about dusk, Joseph was hanging out at the edge of town, and he was just trying to gather more information about this so-called paranormal predator. And after trying and trying, he couldn't really get much more info, and he just began to suspect that this whole thing was just some elaborate tall tale. Very soon, he would learn that this was far from a tall tale. Upon returning back to the village, Joseph would encounter this same story yet again, but from another person who acted far more afraid. He was then informed that there were multiple families ready to pack up and leave if something was not done about this predator lurking at the edge of town. Some of the villagers were terrified, and something was causing this. Joseph knew that in order to spread the word of God to this village, he had to get down to the bottom of this problem and figure out what was lurking outside the village. Was it an exceptionally large tiger? Was it perhaps a trick of the light that was scaring people? Or perhaps maybe it was my beard. Regardless of what it was, Joseph was adamant about figuring this out. So from here, he came up with a plan. He would take both his men and the villagers in a quick construction project and then erect a large hunting blind near a big tree. The location of this hunting blind was going to be constructed no more than 100 yards away from where this predator was most often seen. This would give him all the advantage he would ever need to identify what he was up against. And Joseph wasn't just armed with the word of God. Him and his missionaries were conducting their nightly vigils fully armed to the teeth. They were ready for action. Now, around 2 weeks later, construction was finally complete, and Joseph was able to reach the top of the platform to get a much better lay of the land around him. And as he's up there, he was able to clearly see the spot that this predator was supposed to lurk. Now, a lot of sightings and activity seem to focus around one specific area, where there was this enormous anthill. Keep in mind that ant mounds in jungle regions can get absolutely gigantic, and the one he was looking at was so large and broad at the base that there are actually 7 clear and defined holes that lead underground. Apparently, this is the area where, as locals would be passing by on their trips to the jungle and other local marketplaces, that this predator would pop out of the hole and terrify them. And this is because the path that led alongside the anthill was the main way of leaving town. Now, this whole game of waiting and watching went on for several weeks without anything turning up until October 9th of 1920. Around 5 p.m. in the evening, Joseph and several other men sat up on top of the hunting tower just waiting and watching like they had the previous couple weeks. Suddenly, Joseph and his men spot something moving, and whatever it is coming out of one of the tunnels of the anthill, and it's large. And as Joseph gets a closer look, he realizes that while it is a predator and fearsome to some, it's not exactly what he thought it was. What he's looking at, it's a wolf. And so Joseph is confused but continues to watch, and he sees 2 other wolves around the same size slide out of the tunnels and off into the darkness, and they are followed by a pair of cubs. Now, keep in mind before we go any further that wolves in this region, specifically west of Bengal, are fairly common. And when you're dealing with an anthill of this size, it is more than large enough to accommodate an entire wolf pack. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would a village be terrified of a couple of wolves? There's something more to this going on than meets the eye. Something paranormal, perhaps. Maybe not. But just as Joseph finished that thought, and he's trying to make sense of this confusing sight, something else climbed out of the tunnels that answered all of his questions. He couldn't believe his eyes because whatever this was clearly was not a wolf at all, but something else entirely. However, before I share with you in detail what he saw, there is a horrible twist that comes later. What he saw climbing out of the tunnel looked somewhat like a human being, but it was hideous. He could see that it had hands, feet, and a body like a human, but the head was a big ball of something covering the shoulders and the upper portion of the bust, leaving only a sharp contour of the face visible. Then, right behind it, came another, but smaller in size. Their eyes were bright and piercing, unlike that of a person's. And both these creatures went off and followed the other wolf cubs, both running on all fours. Now, not only was Joseph on edge from seeing this, but his men were also spooked, and they began to raise their rifles to aim. But thinking quickly, Joseph diffused the situation, told them to stand down. There was just something in his gut that explained to him that this isn't right. There's a better course of action. And after peering through the binoculars, both Joseph and his men agreed that whatever they had saw looked far too close to a human being to kill it. This is where the story gets pretty crazy. Now, in order to verify what it is they saw and what they think it was, they decide to stay another night. And just like clockwork, they see the same creatures again. Now that he knows they for sure exist and they are definitely real, he has to find some way to get rid of them because they're causing so much distress to this village. So Joseph comes up with another plan. He hires some people from another village far away where they haven't heard about this predator at all. And because they aren't afraid, they all agree to come out to the ant mound with Joseph and the other missionaries with spades and shovels to break it apart. It took Joseph about a week to go off and gather these men, but once he was ready, he began to execute his plan perfectly. On October 17th, 1920, all the hired workers began chopping away at the gigantic anthill, and it didn't take long before the wolves bolted. The first one ran off into the jungle, the second one did the same thing, but the third wolf, the one that Joseph later identified as the mother, stood her ground. She snarled, she leapt at the workers, ready to defend whatever remained inside the deepest part of the den. The workers had no choice but to kill her. After hours upon hours of back-breaking work, Joseph and all of his armed men finally reached the heart of the wolf den. And here, folks, is where the twist comes in. These men couldn't believe their eyes because what they found left everyone speechless. This was the secret the jungle held. There, curled up in a ball, was a pair of wolf pups. But along with them were the two creatures that had been spotted by not only this village, but Joseph and all of his men. However, now that they could be seen in the light of day, their true identity was revealed. These were human children. One was older, around 8 years old, and the other no more than 18 months. They were both girls. And at this point, all the men were in complete shock because nobody quite understood how they ended up in these living conditions. But you've heard the saying, you've seen the Jungle Book. And since that story was written 26 years earlier, some of the men might have read it by then as well. But here it is, in the flesh, staring back at them. Yes, folks, these girls had been raised by wolves. The girls were rescued and taken back to the village where they were cleaned and their hair was cut. Then the girls traveled with Joseph to an orphanage about 75 miles away in Midnapore. When Joseph wasn't actively pursuing missionary work, he was the rector at this orphanage. A rector is typically the head or director responsible for overseeing the overall management and operation. On November 4th, 1920, Joseph and the two girls arrived in the city, and it was here that he would give them names. The younger of the two he named Amala, while the older girl named Kamala. The girls would continue to receive treatment for their wounds and sores and all the other various injuries that they had received during their tenure in the jungle. But folks, our story doesn't end here. It has an interesting twist. Both girls had been well fed when they had been rescued, but were now starting to show signs of malnutrition in captivity. It was apparent that they were terrified. They had no experience whatsoever being around other human beings. Both the girls began to quickly recover, but the psychological wounds healed much more slowly. The girls had not only been living with the wolves, but they continued to act like the wolves after being brought to the orphanage. And what's truly fascinating about this case is that under these extreme living conditions, both of them seem to have gained heightened senses of hearing and smelling. For example, neither of them seemed bothered by extreme heat or cold, and they also appeared to be able to see in the dark. More on that in a minute. In one instance, Joseph noted that Kamala seemed able to smell an animal being butchered 70 yards away in the kitchen. The moment the cooks began cutting, she raced to try and snatch a piece. Otherwise, they snapped at anyone who approached them with cooked food, which they refused to eat. But raw meat, on the other hand, was quickly gobbled up, especially if it was placed in a bowl on the ground. Even the way they ate was just like a dog. They would lower their mouths to the plate just the way a dog would consume solid foods. Any liquids like water or milk, they would just lap it like a puppy. Also interesting was the fact that both girls rejected having any clothing on their bodies. They simply tore any clothing to shreds. They not only hated the way it felt, but the clothes clearly restricted their movement. Remember that both of these girls moved around pretty well on all fours, and as a result, their knees and palms were covered in thick calluses. And neither girl said a single word, besides growling. And the only other sound the girls would make was when they would howl at night, calling to the other wolves beyond the borders of the city. During the day, they would mostly sleep and avoid the sunlight, and just stare for long hours on end at the wall, doing nothing. Joseph realized the severe condition these girls were in and knew he had a lot of work to do. And so he began to do his best to try and rehabilitate these girls. Many thought they were beyond hope, that their humanity was lost forever, but one woman, a nurse at the orphanage, refused to give up hope. Mrs. Singh. She was determined to connect with the girls, to draw out the human inside of them, and she started by sitting with them for hours, talking gently, even as the girls shied away. Weeks would pass with no progress. Then Mrs. Singh had an idea. She would bring in babies from the orphanage and talked and played with them. As Kamala and Amala watched from a distance, slowly they would creep closer and they would be intrigued by the sounds of Mrs. Singh handing out biscuits and food. It was actually the first sign of a breakthrough. Now, over many months, Mrs. Singh would use food to build trust with the girls. With each biscuit and cup of milk, the girls inched further out of their wild world. But the road to recovery was, of course, very long, and the girls still preferred the company of dogs to humans. They had to be coaxed to wear clothes, to eat with their hands. Even the simplest human behaviors were so foreign to them. And every day before dawn, Mrs. Singh would massage the girls with oil, just really trying to spend time with them, and gradually, the girls stopped resisting her care. And it was a sign that deep down, they did crave human connection, that the wild hadn't snuffed out the human element inside of them completely. Interestingly, Joseph even noted that the girls' facial features seemed to adapt to a life with the wolves. His observation is that they had prominent differences. For example, the formation of jawbones was raised and high, like the modification of the hand and feet. The jaws also had undergone some sort of change in the chewing of bones and constant biting at the meat attached. When they moved their jaws and chewing, the upper and lower jawbones appeared to part and close visibly, unlike human jaws. He even went on and described how their eyes were what he believed to be an adaptation. During the day, they looked as if they were heavy with sleep, but after 12 o'clock at night, they had this strange blue glare, similar to that of a cat or dog in the dark. And when you saw this glare, you were not able to see anything round about them but these two blue powerful lights. Now, I know this sounds far-fetched, but similar things have been observed in other mammals. For example, a domesticated pig that escapes into the wilderness actually starts reverting back to its natural state of being a wild boar. Scientists have observed that a pig released from captivity can quickly grow full tusks, and the color and thickness of their coats changes as well. There is even some evidence that the shape of their skulls change, although these sorts of physical changes haven't been documented in humans. We don't often get the chance to observe human beings raised by animals all that often. However, this story still has a few more twists and turns. In 1921, just as progress was being made, tragedy struck. Amala fell deathly ill with a kidney infection. For days, she lay unconscious, barely breathing, and Kamala kept vigil by her side, trying in vain to rouse her. Sadly, Amala passed away at no older than 2 years old. Kamala was understandably inconsolable. She searched every corner of the orphanage as if Amala might be hiding somewhere. She was gone. Without her, Kamala retreated into herself. She stopped eating, stopped responding to Miss Singh's voice. It was like she had lost her anchor to the human world. But Mrs. Singh refused to lose hope, and she spent even more time with Kamala, talking to her, holding her, willing her back to life. And slowly, over time, she began to come back. She began to play with the other children and imitated their sounds and gestures. And as the years would go on in this orphanage, she eventually became socialized enough to tolerate other human beings and was partially house-trained. In fact, she would walk upright from time to time, but always dropped to all fours whenever she needed to get somewhere fast. She even managed to learn a few simple words. Tragically, in 1929, Kamala succumbed to tuberculosis, just 8 years after she had been rescued. As much as this story has probably tugged on all of your heartstrings, this sort of thing has been well documented. Even over the centuries, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of reports where children were abandoned in some way, shape, or form, only to be raised by animals. Researchers call them feral children. One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from ancient Rome, where its founders were taken in by wolves. In the years since, there have been well-documented cases of children raised not just by wolves, but also dogs, cattle, sheep, goats, and bears. In the case of carnivores, the idea that these children would not only survive, but thrive among these animals is pretty wild, and that has led to a lot of skepticism. Unfortunately, the account of Amala, Kamala, and Joseph Amrito Lao Singh has been criticized in recent years. Despite being witnessed by others and plenty of accompanying photographic evidence, some scholars believe that Joseph's story might have embellished the girl's original discovery. As it turns out, some of the best cases where animals raised human beings are also most recent. Where Amala and Kamala died long ago, other people are still alive today who swear that they spent years with their non-human families. Our next mystery takes us back to the Midwest, to a strange 1961 photograph that allegedly shows a strange upright canine being. The story surrounding it is equally terrifying. Considering it's from the 1960s, well, it's hard to say if it's truly genuine, but either way, it's one heck of a mystery. In the 1960s, a security guard working his overnight shift managed to do the impossible. He collected evidence of something paranormal prowling the streets. A creature which, up until that point, he had only thought was a tall tale, a legend, or something from a horror movie. Something that wasn't human but wasn't an animal either. And in the years since, more and more evidence has piled up, suggesting a terrifying possibility that our entire reality is under invasion from monsters. Monsters that our parents always told us don't exist. You won't want to miss this one. The year is 1961. The place is Big Rapids, Michigan, a town that not only serves as its county seat, but is also home to Ferris State University. It's a small town, but what it lacks in human population, it makes up in wildlife. You see, on the outskirts of town sits the Hay Marsh, a popular wilderness area known for hunting, camping, and the outdoor recreation. The forest is home to tons of Michigan's native animals, and maybe something even wilder. Now, details are scarce because the story and the photograph that was taken were shared secondhand by the eyewitness's son. But according to him, his father used to work at the manufacturing plant. The plant's property sat adjacent to the Hay Marsh. At the time, his father, we'll call him Gary, was working as a night watchman at this manufacturing plant. And most of the time, it was a relatively quiet job, and it even came with a perk. The company provided housing to the guards just across the street, meaning that more often than not, Gary was able to conduct his business from the comfort of his own front porch. I mean, it was kind of a sweetheart deal. Gary would pass the hours just a few feet from his bedroom, staying alert but relaxed. He would sit on his porch, enjoying the sounds of the night, passing his time reading and sipping on coffee. When it was time, he would get up and cross the street to make his rounds, just to check on the property and make sure that nothing was out of the ordinary. But one night, Gary's shift was anything but ordinary. So Gary was a professional. He wasn't the kind of person to be spooked by wildlife. In fact, on his nightly rounds, he often heard and sometimes even saw all sorts of large animals, from coyotes to even bears. And that's all he thought he would find when he heard something odd around 3 a.m. Something had shaken the chain link fence towards the rear of the manufacturing plant. Gary was sure that if he got up from his porch and went looking, he would easily round the corner, find the trespasser, whether they were a human or an animal, and shoo them away. Well, Gary couldn't have been more wrong. He would not find the trespasser. The trespasser would find him, and there was no way he could have ever scared it away. And so Gary stands up from where he's sitting on the front porch, flashlight in one hand, his unholstered pistol in the other, and he's looking down the driveway to the manufacturing plant, just waiting for the intruder to show themselves. And he's doing everything he can to stay quiet because he knows he has a better chance of scaring off whoever or whatever it is if they're more scared than him. And then finally, a shape appears at the edge of the darkness towards the gate, and Gary keeps his flashlight off, trying to get a read on the intruder, only using the little bit of light coming from the streetlights bordering the driveway. It's big, it's tall, and it's dark, but he can't really see much else. After a few minutes of trying to see what is happening, Gary watches as the figure finally steps into the light, and he can't believe his eyes. He's found the source of the sound, but it isn't a human, and it's not a bear or a coyote. Now, slowly, Gary comes to grip with what he's seeing, and according to his son, he was watching something roughly in the shape of a man, but far taller. It was a lot broader across the shoulders, too. Whatever the intruder was, it was covered all over in thick, dark fur, and in the quick glimpse that Gary got, he could see that the head was all wrong. It wasn't the head of a human being. This was too long, almost like it had a snout. In fact, Gary could only compare it to the head of a dog or a wolf, plopped on top of a hairy bodybuilder's physique. In short, Gary was looking at a werewolf. Lucky for Gary, this creature didn't seem to pay him much attention. Instead of snarling or charging him, it just seemed preoccupied with whatever had drawn it to the fence of the manufacturing plant. And Gary watched for a few moments as the monster went from standing upright on 2 legs to dropping down to all 4s and then rising back up like a human being. And then Gary did something that he hadn't ever done before in his entire life. He abandoned his post. Instead of shouting or opening fire, he turned around and headed back inside. Now, remember, his house was just across the street in a building provided by his employer. But Gary wasn't running away because he was afraid. Gary had something else in mind. He wanted proof. After reaching his bedroom, Gary burst inside and made his way straight towards his Kodak Signet 25mm camera. And once he found it, he rushed back outside in the direction of the manufacturing plant, ready to capture evidence of what he had just seen. And Gary didn't have to go far because here's the thing. This werewolf, whatever you want to call it, was headed straight in his direction. Now, the moment he stepped out to his front porch, he saw this thing kind of sneaking down the driveway of the plant. It almost seemed to be using the street line as stations, standing in the glow of one for a few moments before sneaking off into the darkness, only to kind of pop back up into view alongside the next one. When the werewolf reached the 3rd light pole, Gary snapped this black and white photograph of the creature. I mean, what can we say about it? Well, it certainly seems to show something standing underneath the streetlight. The shadows certainly seem right, stretching out to the left behind the pole where the creature is half hidden. Now, Gary's son said that since the lighting conditions were so poor, his father had to use a long exposure method to capture the scene. Unfortunately, this makes it blurrier than he would have liked. As for the figure itself, it seems to not only match Gary's description, but also seems to closely resemble what we've heard from eyewitnesses in other werewolf and dogman stories. I mean, take a look at the head, for instance. It looks like it's set low between a pair of broad shoulders, and you can even see the legs a little, which look oriented backwards, like canine legs. But how tall is this thing? Well, it might help us figure out exactly what we're seeing. Streetlights in America are anywhere from 15 to 40 feet tall, and assuming the one in the picture is on the lower end, it certainly looks more like 15 feet than 40. The creature is over 6.5 feet tall. Now, factor in how it looks like it's hunched over and it could easily stand 7 feet fully upright. I mean, what do you think? I'm on the fence. Something looks a little off about it, if I'm being honest. It doesn't really look like a photograph from the 1960s, and I can't shake the sense that it's been manipulated. Obviously, plenty of people think the same thing and have even run it through software that they claim proves the picture is photoshopped. Look, I've been using Photoshop a long time. I use AI a lot. I claim BS. But it's not up to me, and it's never that simple. Because when he came forward to share the photograph with researchers, Gary's son supposedly provided the original negatives for analysis. Excuse me, negative, not negatives. And this would seem to rule out any manipulation after the fact, meaning that it strongly suggests that whatever is in the picture was captured at the time rather than added afterward in post-production. But this isn't enough for skeptics. Some of them point to the fact that there seems to be a stand or pedestal at the bottom of the picture that the dogman is standing on. This is crystal clear in the picture, leading lots of folks to assume that the figure is just a statue or a movie prop. But who knows? Like the being itself, that shape underneath its feet could be anything. The picture is just not clear enough. And at any rate, according to this story, this picture was taken mere moments before it ran off conveniently into the darkness in the direction of the hay marsh on all fours. Now, Gary never saw it again and rarely spoke about his sighting with his family. And over the years, he would tell his son not to play outside after dark, but that's about all he would say. It wasn't until decades later that Gary shared this picture with his son, who finally released it to the public. Now, whether or not the photograph from 1961 is authentic, sightings of dogmen continue to this day in the upper Midwest. Now, we're going to jump back to Ohio. Well, it's close to Ohio, Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. And it's a town that's historically known for one of the most infamous UFO cases in recent history. It's got everything you could want: a crashed UFO, the military coming in and covering it up, and redacted documents. Something strange took place that night. What? We're still not sure. For this next story, we're going to extend Ohio's limits to Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, for just a bit. Fortunately, Kecksburg is only roughly 100 miles from Ohio, so we'll make it count. On December 9th, 1965, William Davis and his wife were getting ready to go home after a long day of work and going to the grocery store to pick up some last-minute items. It was another ordinary day in the week. William and his wife get in their car, they're driving back home, and they're engaged in conversation about their plans for the upcoming weekend, and visiting some family they haven't seen in a while. About 15 minutes goes by, and William pulls up in the driveway. He turns the car off and pivots his body to open the door to step out. As William starts to move, he can hear his wife directly behind him start screaming. Out of reaction, he looks at her and sees her pointing upwards to the sky. His eyes follow where she's pointing, and this large, fiery object is soaring through the sky. Within seconds of watching the sky, the realization that it's not just traveling straight, but it's about to crash down into the earth and very close by. A few more seconds go by, and bam! Whatever this object was smacks into the earth, sending a shockwave that could be felt for miles. William snaps out of his gaze. He sees that many of his neighbors, like him, are also watching this happen. The impact shook the ground beneath William's feet, and a loud boom was audible. His wife started whimpering and crying, her hand now clutching William's arm, and for just a moment, a strange silence settled over the neighborhood. The occasional dog barking could be heard in the distance. He knew he had to investigate and ensure that no one was hurt. He turned to his wife, told her to stay put, and said he would check it out, and departed. In an act of quick thinking, William jumped back into his car, the engine still warm from their recent return. His hands trembled as he turned the key, overcome with all the things this could be. What if this was a bomb sent by the Soviet Union? After all, this was in the Cold War era. All these thoughts raced through his mind then. Even the familiar engine noises did not calm his nerves. He peeled out of the driveway without a word to his wife, who stood frozen on the porch, and William's eyes darted between the road and the sky, searching for any sign of where the object might have landed. He had an idea of the general direction, but the disturbing observation of how empty the streets were bothered him. After about 10 minutes of tense driving, following his gut instinct and the fading trail of smoke in the sky, William arrived at a large plot of undeveloped land on the neighborhood's outskirts. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a war-torn landscape. What would typically be thick foliage was now a ghostly scene of sparse dead trees. The impact had cleared a significant area. Branches lay scattered across the ground, some still smoldering. The air was thick with the bitter smell of burnt vegetation, or whatever vegetation there was in December, and something else, something metallic and chemical. While thoughts of this being the result of a bomb sent from the Soviet Union faded in his mind, the feeling in his gut that something was wrong only intensified. William killed the engine, but left the headlights on, and as he climbed out of his car, he could immediately sense how still and unsettling this scene was. He squinted in the darkness, trying to make out any sign of what he was looking for, and there was something else in the air. Something he couldn't identify. The smell of smoke and something else. Acrid and unfamiliar filled his nostrils. As he approached the woods, William saw an orange glow peeking through the trees. After slowing his pace, William became aware of the potential danger. What if it was a plane crash, or worse, some kind of military accident? He moved cautiously, and the only light that aided him was his flashlight. A few more moments of looking, a few more steps, and William stopped. He saw something he couldn't explain. In a small clearing, partially obscured by fallen trees and disturbed earth, was an object unlike anything William had ever seen. It was roughly acorn-shaped, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, with a metallic surface that seemed to shimmer despite the dirt and debris covering it. The object was steaming, wisps of vapor rising into the night air. He felt drawn to it. As he edged closer, he saw the surface clearer. The object appeared covered in hieroglyphics, strange symbols of an ancient and forgotten language. They pulsed faintly with an eerie blue glow. Whatever William was looking at had him in a trance. That trance was soon broken by the sound of branches breaking behind him. Whirling around, William shone his flashlight at the approaching strangers and saw it was several of his neighbors. They, too, were coming to see what this was. Their expression was the same as William's. Their eyes are wide, their mouths are open, and one of the men asks William, "What on God's green earth is that thing?" Before William could answer, a low hum began emanating from the object. The symbols pulsed brighter, and the ground beneath their feet vibrated. All of them started yelling and running, and as if on cue, all the men could hear the distant sirens coming. As the other men ran and took off back to their cars, William stopped and turned around one last time to look at the object. A wave of dread washed over him, making his stomach churn. He just knew he shouldn't be here. Before he could make it back to his car, strange black vehicles were already pulling up to the scene, and men in suits were approaching William. As they approached him, he saw their faces were cold and expressionless. To say he was intimidated was an understatement. Before William could speak, he was quickly ushered by these men away from this area, back to his car, and threatened not to talk about what he had seen to anyone. As he's being forcefully taken back to his vehicle, William can see men approaching the object in hazmat-type suits. One of these men leaned in close to William and told him firmly,
"Mr. Davis, what you've seen here tonight is a matter of national security. You will not speak of this to anyone. Not your wife, not your friends, not even your priest. Do you understand?"
At this point, William is terrified. Not only do these men know his name, but it's evident they know a disturbing amount about his life and family. He feels sweat pouring down his face, his mouth dried, and he slowly nods. The man's demeanor seemed to instantly change. His expressionless face changed to a frown, and his tone became aggressive as he gripped William's arm painfully.
"If you breathe a word of this to anyone, there will be consequences. Unimaginable consequences."
And then this man said something to William that shook him.
"Your wife, Mary. It would be a tragedy if anything were to happen to her, wouldn't it?"
Without another word, he was shoved into his vehicle. William didn't hesitate. He started his car and drove off while these men never broke eye contact with him. When William pulled into the driveway, his wife was still on the porch waiting for him. He exited the car and slumped to the front door like he was still in shock. William held his wife in silence for several moments as the sounds of emergency vehicles and helicopters could be heard in the distance. He had no way to explain the events of that night and knew he could not tell his wife what it was. William knew that whatever happened next, the peaceful life he'd known in Kecksburg was about to change forever. The object in the sky was just the beginning of a mystery that would haunt this small Pennsylvania town for years to come. What witnesses saw that evening was a large acorn-shaped object with strange markings. It was described as being about the size of a small vehicle, and while it did have a strange smell, a bizarre hissing sound accompanied it. Some eyewitnesses described the smell as specifically similar to kerosene or burnt metal. Soon after the object crashed, the military arrived on the scene and quickly removed and transported the object to an unknown location. The entire scene was cordoned off and became off-limits to civilians. Much of the public demanded answers, but the government was silent. Eventually, the official explanation to the public was that it was just a meteorite, and that the public should not be so quick to assume it was anything other than. But this was something multiple people witnessed. Strangely, the fact that there were markings or writing on this foreign object says a lot about what this could have been. In fact, witnesses explain and describe the markings as similar to ancient Egyptian symbols and hieroglyphs. Many of those same eyewitnesses also witnessed military personnel examining them closely, preparing them for transportation. Most disturbing is that the military had removed this object so quickly that it appeared as if they had prior knowledge of its landing and had planned to retrieve it after it crashed. Interestingly, following the government's official explanation for the strange event, there was never once official documentation released to the public that supplied evidence to support its claim. For many who knew there was more to the story than what was told, it was their smoking gun that a cover-up was involved. Fast forward to more recent times, the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, has been investigating this incident, interviewing multiple eyewitnesses. Moreover, the Pennsylvania state legislature passed a resolution requiring government documents relating to this incident to be released. In recent times, NASA, out of all companies, had documents related to the 1965 Kecksburg UFO crash that they were tightly withholding. Unfortunately, for NASA, it took legal recourse to obtain documents. In October of 2007, in a settlement, NASA was required to provide hundreds of documents to an investigative journalist named Leslie Kean. It took a while for NASA to gather all their documents together, but as of August 2009, they had given her everything. Interestingly, she wrote a paper and posted it online, explaining the lengthy legal process of digging into these documents. But sadly, it appeared as if she couldn't find much. at least anything that would pinpoint her in the direction of answers. She noted that many of the files were either missing or destroyed. Well, that's funny. Surely the American government wouldn't do anything to try and hide information from the public regarding an event as benign as a small meteorite, right? Why would they? Well, here's my question to all of you watching this. Why is it that in various State Department documents, NASA appears to have played a role in the recovery of this meteorite? Come on, guys, are you telling me NASA's in on this too? Next, you're going to tell me the mainstream media lies to us. To narrow things down even more, it appears unlikely that the object in question was not a Russian satellite, at least according to data from the Russian Space Agency and U.S. Space Command. You need to understand that this event was so significant that multiple books and documentaries were written about it. In fact, a book that many of you will probably recognize is The Day the Earth Stood Still at Kecksburg, written by Stan Gordon. Unfortunately, even many documentaries and books that go into deeper investigations don't provide the concrete answers we're all looking for. While they offer more insight and are worth reading and watching, the truth is still hidden from the public eye. The Kecksburg UFO crash of 1965 still stands as one of the strangest, most mysterious events in history. This is just me thinking out loud, but this event reminds me a lot of the 1952 Flatwoods Monster UFO case because of its similarities, but I'll save that for another episode. The reason for including this story in today's episode is the sheer scale of the event. The number of people who witnessed it was staggering. This phenomenon reached farther than Kecksburg. Eyewitnesses ranged from Ohio, Michigan, and up to Canada. That equals thousands of people, and it was also tracked on radar. Unfortunately, the truth behind the object that landed on December 9th, 1965, near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, will never be revealed. It's no secret that the Appalachian mountain range has been a host to all things strange and mysterious. However, the accounts I will share in this next segment baffle modern-day science. If these eyewitnesses are genuine, then there's truly something going on in the woods that surpasses our understanding of the very reality we live in. On July 28th, at around 2 in the morning at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, a strange man appeared to several campers in the area. However, the only thing more unsettling than his appearance was the message he had to deliver. Brad Ginn and Madeline Durand, campers at Mammoth Cave National Park, were just hanging out, enjoying the beautiful night, and enjoying a genuine camping experience. Now, at this point, it was pretty early on in the morning, and so they're sitting around the roaring fire, the sounds of crickets in the distance, and as they're lost in conversation, Brad decides to check his phone, and he notes that it's almost 2 in the morning, but hey, it's summertime. There's no reason to turn in early, right? Well, as they continue conversing, Brad decides, you know what, it's time to turn in, and so, very shortly after, he goes and crashes out. Now, at some point shortly after this, Brad wakes up to some strange noises that are happening right outside of his tent, and so he's kind of coming to and realizing they're getting louder. Immediately, he realizes that it's a person approaching their tent and is off-put by this because he thinks something bad is about to take place. And for anyone watching this, if an individual began approaching you, especially early on in the morning, I would feel like it could really only be one of two things. Either someone is in need of help, or they're looking to hurt you. Okay, maybe not hurt you, but I wouldn't consider it a good thing. And as this mysterious person gets close enough, they start talking to Brad, claiming that something had destroyed their campsite. And then they said something very strange, which was something along the lines of that this was Bigfoot country, that Brad needed to be careful. He was in the process of searching for whatever had destroyed his campsite and warned both of them to be very careful.
They said that it was also Bigfoot country, which seemed a little weird that they would say that.
The individual then informed them that they were searching for whatever destroyed their campsite and warned them to be careful.
He said, I hope you have weapons, and then he, flashed his gun at us. He was like, I have this, so if anything happens to you, then just yell and I'll come.
Before he departs, he explained that he hopes Brad and Madeline have weapons and that if anything ever happens that these two should just yell and he'll come. Then he told them the most terrifying part. If they hear gunshots, run. What an odd thing to tell a random stranger in the middle of the night, right? Well, check this out. How would you even begin to go to sleep after that? And probably just a few minutes after this, Brad explained how him and Madeline saw this man's lights approaching yet again, and before they could even formulate any sort of response or any thought as to what to do, they just began to hear this man yelling something along the lines of, "Oh my God, do you see that? There it is!" And, they're looking out from their tents, it's dark, so they can't really see that well, and they're not exactly sure what this man's yelling about. They probably think he's just off his rocker. And then the man pulls out his gun and shoots into the darkness. Both Brad and Madeline are freaked out. They rush over to see what's happening, and the guy is just telling them that he saw Sasquatch emerging from the brush right near their tent, and it began approaching him. And as you can imagine, you would probably feel pretty intimidated by that, so he just starts firing. Now, shortly after this, Brad and Madeline both called 911 and decided to just hike the 5 miles back to their car in the parking lot, where they would later meet up with park rangers. Now, obviously, something to this degree is going to be taken rather seriously by park officials and law enforcement. Now, whether he had actually seen Bigfoot or not remains up for debate. But interestingly, a spokeswoman for the Mammoth Cave National Park actually made a press statement and confirmed that law enforcement did indeed respond to an incident involving an individual with a firearm about 2 a.m. on Sunday, July 28th.
So Mammoth Cave National Park law enforcement rangers responded to a reporting of an individual with a firearm at one of our backcountry campsites. The rangers made contact with all the parties involved. It is an ongoing investigation at this time.
And that, fortunately, there were no injuries. The only other thing she added was that the incident was still being investigated by park officials. And for those that aren't familiar with Kentucky state law, it is perfectly legal to bring a firearm into a state park. It's just illegal to discharge said firearm. Now, bear with me before you scoff and roll your eyes at such a ridiculous story. It's interesting to note that Kentucky and Mammoth Cave have had a massive amount of Bigfoot sighting reports over the years. In fact, over the last 20 to 25 years, there have been over 400 Bigfoot reports in this area of the Appalachian Mountains alone. And it's not just the general area. As a matter of fact, there have been supposed sightings within the Mammoth Cave National Park. Back in the summer of 1990, one man claimed to have seen a large, hairy creature down on what he assumed to be on all fours walking around. Now, his initial instinct is that he had run into a black bear, and he began to slow down because you obviously don't want to cross paths with a bear. But this is when this creature surprised him by rising up on 2 legs and standing somewhere right around 8 feet tall. It actually looked at him, and this is when he could see more detail and definition. Keep in mind, he was on his 4-wheeler at the time, so he was quickly able to turn and get away, but he noted that as soon as this thing saw him and stood up, it too turned around and bolted off into the darkness. A similar terrifying experience happened on October 18th, 2018 in Sandy Hook, Kentucky. And on this evening, Denise and her husband were simply visiting some family in Sandy Hook. And so after their visit, it's roughly about 7:30 p.m., and so they both get in the car. And keep in mind that because of the time of year, we're getting into fall, so it's already dark and cold. And so he gets on the phone with his grandmother, and they're just chatting away. And it's because of this phone call is why they can remember the exact time. At 7:45 p.m., the phone call ends, and Denise's husband realizes that the low fuel light has now come on. And so he's thinking, oh crap, we can't sit here, we can't dilly-dally any longer than necessary, we need to go and get gas. And so Denise and her husband get in the car and they're driving down the road, and at this point, nothing spectacular or out of place was really going on. It was just another mundane drive. But if you live in states that have a lot of forest, like Kentucky, you're probably more prone to picking out animals by the road, like deer. And so Denise immediately spots something in the hollow directly ahead of them. And at first, she couldn't really make out many details because it was out of range of the headlights. And if she had to calculate, it was maybe roughly around 80 feet away. When these sorts of things happen, they happen very quickly. So this is all within a matter of 5 to 10 seconds at most. But when you see something like this, that this is so out of the ordinary, it really does stick with you. And so, as she spots what she thinks is a deer, she's about to scream out to her husband that, hey, there's a deer in the road, you need to be careful. This thing, moving quickly, does not crawl or jump, but actually walks across the road. And she had this horrible realization that she just saw it walk on 2 legs, not 4. And so she starts screaming, turn on your brights, there's something in the road. And she could see in those few seconds of illumination from the headlights that whatever this was, it had a very thick abdomen and had to have been at least 7 feet tall. And interestingly, wasn't black, but the color of a tree, so like a grayish brown, very earthy in tone. Of course, the husband only saw movement and saw what he can only describe as a strange shadow, but he never did see the creature or more to the effect of the specifics that his wife saw. Denise explained that she didn't get to see the feet, hands, or any other facial details like the eyes or mouth. Now, what's fascinating is the direction in which this animal was coming from. The area is very tall, steep, and mountainous, and the direction it went as it cleared the road also has a large drop-off and is very steep, a road which happens to be very wooded and very secluded. Now, later on, after Denise and her husband had come back from running their errand, they tried to slowly drive around the area and do some inspecting, but they didn't see anything. Although that night, they noticed the neighborhood dogs were behaving very strangely. They were barking and howling all night long, which did seem unusual. And one of the dogs even acted as if he could see something in the distance and began to growl and stalk before he would take off and go chase after it. Also, apparently, around 2008 to 2010, Denise's own mother had an experience that was also strange and also happened to be in that exact same spot. Except for her, she was walking to a neighbor's house and it was in broad daylight. And as she passed by the area, a couple of rocks were thrown off the hill right beside the road. She was never able to pinpoint or discern the source, but had the distinct impression that something was stalking her from up higher in the hill. Now, what I find very fascinating personally is that while there are a large multitude of Bigfoot and cryptid sightings in and around this area, and specifically the Appalachian region, there are also a plethora of cave systems, many of which remain completely unexplored and hidden away from human contact. It makes you wonder if there truly is some correlation there, that maybe if there are Bigfoot in this region, that they're living down in the earth in the cave system. I know, it's just wild conjecture, but it does make you wonder. Unfortunately, it remains a mystery whether the man who claims to have seen and shot at a Bigfoot actually encountered the creature. The existence of a population of Bigfoot in the Mammoth Cave National Park area and the broader Appalachian Mountain region also remains an unsolved question. Before we get into this next story, we need to understand the entire context. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. In the early 1960s, when Kyle Lovern was around 8 or 9 years old, he and his family were sitting out on their front porch in Nolan, West Virginia. It was a rather quiet and boring life. In fact, it was much the same like everybody else. However, something would happen that night that would change the course of Kyle's life forever and make him question the very fabric of reality that we exist in. His family decided that this evening they would go out and sit on the porch to enjoy the beautiful weather. And as Kyle can remember it clearly, It was in the evening. The sun was going down, and his family sitting there on the front porch, lost in conversation, enjoying each other's company, when Kyle noticed something clearly out of place. And so he looks over and gasps in astonishment and begins pointing. And so naturally, out of reaction, the rest of his family looks over and they spot it too. What all of them could see were clearly 3 oddly shaped UFOs just hovering above a mountain not too far away from Kyle's home. And these weren't just planes, these were objects that were glowing and looked very alien, no pun intended, before slightly tilting and vanishing. Now, after that experience, Kyle had no idea how to explain what this was or what it could have been. In fact, his entire family that was with him was just as baffled. And because of how things were at that time, they just decided not to really talk about it and to keep it to themselves. However, folks, this would not be Kyle's last experience with something bizarre in the sky. Fast forward to the fall of 1973, and it was right around this time there was a strange bit of sightings that happened all along the East Coast. It was here that Kyle himself and a good friend had a sighting of their very own. He and his friend were just casually driving around at night, and they suddenly spotted something off in the distance. Now, at first, this caught both of them completely off guard. They're lost in conversation, and all of a sudden, there's just this bright blue light that goes shooting across the night sky, and it completely took both of them off guard and made Kyle slam on his brakes. And both men had no idea what to make of what they had just seen. Not to mention, they could not explain, just on a pure physics level, how this mysterious aircraft was able to zoom across the night sky at an unfathomable speed, and then there was the strange, ominous, glowing blue light. And how could it just vanish into thin air? Now, immediately, Kyle is brought back to that moment when he was around 8 or 9 years old with his family on his porch, and that was a pretty pivotal moment for him. He realized, oh my gosh, UFOs are definitely a thing and not just a once-in-a-lifetime experience. There really is something to this. Now, to get down to the nitty-gritty and find the truth, Kyle then dedicated himself to the study of ufology and became somewhat known in his small circle. Now that we have the context, let's jump ahead to the date in question. On October 16th, 2012, something strange was spotted above the skies of the Appalachian Mountains. Residents of southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky were going about their day-to-day when suddenly an unidentified flying object appeared, hovering ominously in the clear blue sky. Immediately, people knew who to call, and within minutes, the phone of Kyle Lovern, a local journalist and author of 2 books on UFO sightings in the region at the time, was ringing off the hook at the offices of the Williamson Daily News. Now, you have to understand, UFO sightings are not uncommon in these parts, but what made this incident so strange was that it occurred in broad daylight and witnessed by countless people across the area. As Lovern himself put it, at night you see a lot of lights, which could probably be explained, but this was a daytime sighting. Intrigued by the flurry of reports, he grabs his camera and sprang into action. He had a hunch that this strange object might be visible from just outside the newspaper office, and he was right. Across the street, at the local automotive repair shop, he could clearly make out the UFO just suspended in the sky like some otherworldly apparition. Lovern described the sight as vertical, almost like 2 fluorescent lights together. It was very unusual. It would get real bright, then it would get dimmer, then get real bright again. And as he stood there transfixed by this bizarre spectacle, Lovern's curiosity began to draw the attention of others, the mechanics at the auto shop, their customers, and even Lovern's own co-workers at the newspaper soon found themselves gathered outside, all eyes turned up towards the sky, just marveling at this bizarre phenomenon. Word of the sighting spread like wildfire, and before long, hundreds of people across Williamson, Pikeville, and all around the area had reported the same thing. A strange, luminous object that seemed to defy any and all explanation. Even more intriguing was the sudden appearance of numerous jets flying overhead. Lovern estimates that at least 20 aircraft passed through the area, their presence adding to the already surreal atmosphere. Now, this is only a theory, Lovern had said, but I think this thing was showing up on radar and they were checking it out. So they were so close together and so many of them, I don't think they were passenger jets, but they were so high I couldn't tell for sure. The object remained in the sky for several hours, its purpose and origin a complete mystery. Lovern, determined to get a better look, decided to make his way to the local high school. Now, in hopes to capture some photos from a higher vantage point. But by the time he arrived, this craft had vanished, leaving behind an entire community buzzing with speculation and wonder. However, some of the best images was actually by a high school teacher by the name of Alan Epling. Impressively, he only used a telescope to capture video of it. In fact, in his YouTube video description, he explained that while there were numerous sightings of the same object at the same time, covering a total of 4 states, the sightings were clear, and it was a blue, cloudless sky. And there were no other aircraft in sight. And what's even more bizarre is that this object just continued to hover there in the same location for over 2 hours, never drifting more than 10 degrees in any direction. It was almost as if it was observing those below. I mean, what do you guys think? The sightings quickly made headlines, not just in the local media, where Lovern himself reported on the event, but also in national news outlets. The Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, a Cincinnati-based organization dedicated to investigating UFO sightings worldwide, took a very keen interest in the case, ultimately declaring it unexplained after a thorough investigation. But folks, this wasn't the only sighting. As a matter of fact, there was a similar sighting reported just the day prior in Huntsville, Alabama, and 1 day later in Cross Junction, Virginia. On top of that, there was a third one in Gardner, New York on October 18th. There was clearly something going on here. For a strange UFO in the sky to be seen by all these different people across all these different states, it makes you wonder, what was this? Now, here's where it gets even more interesting and where things regarding the Appalachian Mountain and Appalachian Trail kind of come together and tie in with everything we've talked about. Kyle Lovern has 2 books. Well, they're more case studies on strange UFO sightings and phenomena all around the Appalachians. And just like Kyle's experience, he had ran into many eyewitnesses who were very reluctant to tell their stories, or would only do it under the stipulation that a different name was used. And as a matter of fact, there's a very notorious sighting that pops up in one of his books about a mountaintop removal mining site up in the Appalachians. It was during this point in time where this witness and roughly 20 to 25 other workers also witnessed the same thing. They described a strange UFO-like craft that stopped and hovered right above the mine site. Then, it did something unexpected. It shone a light down on all of them for a little bit of time and then shot off and moved around the area to another mining site that was in a nearby valley. Remember that this was spotted by 20 plus individuals and they all corroborated the same story. Now, I don't want you guys to think for a second that these are isolated incidents. As a matter of fact, there's an entire Facebook page dedicated to strange UFO research, specifically in the Appalachian area. I mean, let's be real though, the Appalachian Mountains span quite a bit of land, so there's a lot of room to play with. However, when we actually look at some of these cases and sightings by all these eyewitnesses, there does seem to be some continuity. On February 14th, 2024, a man had just gotten home from picking up his niece and decided that he would spend the evening out on his porch, much like Kyle did. As he was sitting on the porch enjoying the evening breeze, he decided to look up because something had caught his eye. And as a matter of fact, what he thought at first was a plane or a satellite turned out to be something not of this world. He looked up and he realized that what he was looking at was none other than this bright, hazy glowing UFO heading off in the eastern direction. Now, we want to note here that there are lots of planes and satellites that go over this man's house, but this object moved much slower than any of those. So, quickly thinking, he reaches down into his pocket, pulls out his phone, and starts recording for over 30 seconds. And he's just mind blown at what this is and the fact that he's actually capturing it. And after about 30 seconds of filming this, he decides to end the video, put his phone away, and he begins to watch this more closely, and he realizes there's something he's missed. There's something else there. He sees this small star-like object following the larger one pretty closely. Then he notices that all of a sudden, these two objects have both stopped emitting this really bright light and appeared to emit a very bright light from the bottom of the craft. And he went on to state that this was not an ordinary light. It was almost perfectly cylindrical, like a cone emitting towards the ground, but it didn't quite reach that far. And so he's trying to quickly think, and he's trying to pull out his phone to record it, but he missed it by just a few seconds. He was able to record about 1.5 minutes of this strange object until the lights completely dimmed to a star-like brightness, and that was that. Now what's interesting is that these two lights seem to converge into one solid object and look almost like a black triangle of sorts. Eventually, after some time had passed, they kind of just dimmed out of existence and could no longer be seen in the night sky. This eyewitness, who never mentioned his name, also noticed that when he initially saw this strange object, that it had a bright white light with this kind of hazy glow around it. To further aid in the authenticity of this man's sighting, the weather conditions were great, with the sky being completely void of any clouds and everything very visible. However, anonymous lights and strange things spotted in the skies above the Appalachian mountain range have gone back many, many years. In fact, these became such a widely viewed phenomenon that they even earned themselves a name, the Brown Mountain Lights. Now, one of the earliest accounts of these was actually published back in the Charlotte Daily Observer in 1913. But sightings aren't sparse like you might think. As a matter of fact, they've been happening for years and years all over. Now, you might be sitting there saying, well, hold on a second. All these strange anomalous lights could easily be light distortions in the lens or even small insects. The only problem with that assumption is that the video in question was filmed in the wintertime, and I'm pretty sure lightning bugs, as they're known in this region, are not active. There has to be an explanation for all this strange phenomena, right? I mean, normally I would agree with you. The Brown Mountain Lights anomaly isn't isolated to just what's been caught on film. I want you guys to understand that this anomaly is so widespread, there are so many different facets to it, including but not limited to the history, old sightings, and new sightings, that we would just need an entire video series just to do it justice. Unfortunately, the tube-shaped UFOs seen by Kyle and others in neighboring towns, along with the ones he saw in his youth, as well as the other unusual lights and UFOs in the area, and the phenomena known as the Brown Mountain Lights, all continue to be unexplained mysteries. Lastly, strange footage captured by a Japanese research vessel has experts stumped. No one can agree exactly what it shows. Still, if anything, far more terrifying things exist deep in the ocean than we care to acknowledge. To understand the video I showed you, the Ningen and everything that builds around it, well, we need to go back in time. On February 13th, 1958, something strange was spotted in the icy waters of the Antarctic, and it would set the stage for things to come. Around 7 in the evening, the Soya 3 Antarctica observation ship is making its way around Barton Island, navigating through the ice, and Captain Matsumoto is at the helm, along with his navigator Yoshida and chief engineer Shigematsu, the helmsman. Now the sun's still up thanks to the time of year, so visibility is great. Now suddenly, about 1,000 feet out, they spot something floating in the water. At first, Captain Matsumoto thinks it's just an old oil drum. It's black and about the same size. But as they get closer, he realizes it's actually some kind of animal trapped in the ice. Now, here's where it gets weird. According to the captain, this thing's face looks like a cow's when viewed head-on. It's got a pair of twitching ears, which is odd for a marine animal, and the rest of its body covered in brown spotted hair with a hint of a serrated fin running down its back. Now, Shigematsu races below deck to grab his camera, but by the time he gets back, the creature has freed itself from the ice and vanished. The whole sighting lasted only about half a minute, but it left a lasting impression on Captain Matsumoto. He even dubbed it the Antarctic Godzilla. Now, while this creature was small, there are many similarities to it and something seen years later that was much larger. What this captain saw could possibly have been a juvenile. Fast forward nearly 20 years, and on April 28, 1974, or maybe a few years earlier, depending on who you ask, something seriously strange went down off the coast of New Zealand. The research Japanese whaling ship, the 28th Konpira Maru, was just minding its own business about 25 miles offshore when Captain Kimura spotted what he thought was a second buoy bobbing in the water. But as he took a closer look through the spyglass, he realized this was no buoy. No, what he saw was a gigantic head, almost human-like, sticking a solid 5 feet out of the water. And when I say gigantic, I mean this thing was so big that even with that much of it showing, the captain couldn't even see its mouth. What he could see, though, were its eyes. Big, goggly, reddish eyes. Each one 4 to 5 inches wide. The skin was all wrinkled and grayish brown, and it had a pair of nostrils that looked weirdly crushed. The captain was so baffled by this, he sketched out what he saw later on. Now, at first, he thought it might be a submarine, and then he considered a new type of whale or a seriously lost walrus. However, none of that made sense, and the closest thing he could come up with was a massive hippo, but that was just as crazy. Hippos don't exactly hang out in the ocean near New Zealand. So Captain Kimura ordered his crew to ready the harpoons and steer straight for this thing. But as soon as they got within about 100 feet, poof, it vanished beneath the waves, leaving nothing but a trail in the water and a very confused captain. They nicknamed it the Cabagon, or Hippo Monster. But even the captain admitted that didn't quite fit, because let's be real, what they saw that day sure sounded a lot more like a colossal humanoid head. In fact, the Konpira Maru headed back to Japan without any hard evidence, and the captain was hesitant to report it for fear of sounding crazy. But a few days later, folks in the nearest town began reporting weird footprints by the shore. Coincidence? I think not. Now, you have to understand that around this time, the Japanese whaling industry was in a tough spot. I mean, sure, it was still making money and was a big part of their culture, but the rest of the world was putting a lot of pressure on them to stop for the sake of the environment. So, two things happened. First, the industry shrank a lot. Second, the government started doing what they call research whaling. And basically, instead of hunting a bunch of whales, they would only catch a few and then they would dissect them and study them. The idea was that by doing this, they could get a better understanding of how the whale population as a whole was doing, which should lead to more sustainable hunting practices. At least that was the theory. But this is where it gets interesting. With all this focus on research whaling, you have to wonder, did they stumble across something they weren't expecting? Something like, I don't know, the Cabagon? So does this mean that the creature spotted back in 1958 truly was just a juvenile? It is a tantalizing possibility. And if there really is a connection between these two sightings, it raises even more questions. What is it? Where did it come from? Is it some kind of previously unknown species or something else entirely? And why has it been spotted in such far-flung locations from the Antarctic to the waters off New Zealand? What's interesting is around this same time, stories began popping up that a report of the Cabagon actually was made, and that officials were taking a serious interest in this mysterious creature. There were even allegations that the Japanese government was trying to keep a tight lid on the whole thing, supposedly issuing gag orders to eyewitnesses. Now, it doesn't seem like they were actively investigating the Cabagon, but it sure sounds like they were keeping a close eye on any news reports. But you know how it goes. Some of those sightings still managed to slip through the cracks. Sadly, folks, the true identity of the creatures spotted in 1958 and 1974 remain inconclusive. Years ago, an anonymous Japanese whistleblower explained that they learned something disturbing through a trusted source who works as a marine life researcher at Hokkaido University. This friend revealed that in the northern seas, there's a creature called the Hitogata that no one knows about yet. And here's where it gets really unsettling. According to the researcher, this thing is massive. I mean, like 15 to 20 meters long, but that's not even the worst part. Apparently, it has what looks like a human face. A giant unknown sea creature with a human face, and it gets worse. The researcher claims that this Hitogata often runs away when you try to talk to it, and sometimes it talks back. We're not just dealing with a mysterious massive sea creature here, we're talking about one that might be intelligent enough to communicate. Now, the whistleblower was understandably skeptical at first, and they asked their friend that if such a creature exists, wouldn't it have already been found? But the researcher's response was chilling, and they informed the friend that some fishermen do know about the Hitogata's existence, but for some reason, they won't talk about it. And apparently, it's often seen during the cold winter months. Now, a bunch of additional sightings began taking place in the 1990s, the most notable being a whaling vessel that claimed to have encountered something truly bizarre while conducting research off the coast of Antarctica. Now, at first, the crew thought they had spotted just another whale, but as they got closer, they realized it wasn't a whale at all. In fact, it wasn't anything like they'd ever seen before. What surfaced near their ship was this massive humanoid creature, somewhere between 60 to 100 feet long. Its skin was pure white, the color and texture of whale blubber, but this was no whale. This thing was very much alive, and disturbingly, it had the rough features of an enormous human being. Now, the crew dubbed this creature the Ningen, which simply means human in Japanese. In this initial sighting, the eyewitnesses claimed that the Ningen had the vague outline of a head, a torso, two massive arms, and a pair of gigantic legs. Now, since then, other sightings of the Ningen have popped up on the internet, and each one adding a new and sometimes conflicting detail. Some claim that the creature's arms end in flippers, while others insist that they have hands with 5 fingers, just like a human. There are even some who say the Ningen resembles a massive mermaid, but one thing that seems to be consistent across most sightings is the creature's face. Witnesses say that when facial features are visible, the Ningen has a large, slit-like mouth and eyes that are either tiny and beady or enormous and gaping, similar to the eyes described by Captain Kimura and the crew of the Maru. Now, if this whistleblower and their researcher friend are telling the truth, then we've got a giant, intelligent, human-faced creature swimming around in the northern seas, and the locals are keeping it a secret. But why? What are they afraid of? If there are creatures out there that are not only physically imposing, but also possess a frightening level of intelligence, then what else might be lurking in the depths of the ocean? It's a question that keeps me up at night, and I have a feeling I'm not the only one. Now, what's fascinating here is there's another creature called the Yumibozu, a spirit or yokai that's said to live under the sea. And let me tell you folks, this thing is bad news. Now, according to legend, whenever this thing pops up from the water, it can turn a calm day into a raging storm in an instant, and if it appears to sailors, well, they're in for a rough time. The Yumibozu either wrecks their ship or demands a bucket or bail from them, which it then uses to drown the poor sailors one by one. The descriptions of this thing sound an awful lot like the Cabagon sightings dating back from the 1970s. I mean, we're talking gigantic, with a size measured in yards than feet. And when it first appears, all you see is this huge head popping out of the water. In fact, the only real difference between the Maru incident and the Yumibozu legends is that the Yumibozu is usually described as being dark black instead of gray. Oh, and the fact that Yumibozu sightings always seem to end in tragedy. Looking back, it sounds like the crew of the Maru got off lucky. Now, get this. If you dig around a bit, you'll find another name that's been thrown around, the Ningen. And folks, probably the most eerie part about this whole Ningen thing is the fact that, unlike Bigfoot, Dogman, Mothman, reptilians, etc., there's actually a lot of photographs of this mysterious thing. In fact, this photograph was actually taken during the 1990 sighting, and even though it's not very detailed, you can clearly make out the shape. This alone would be enough to frighten any sailor. Now, fast forward to 2007, and the Ningen photos and videos have begun to surface on various spots on the internet. Of course, many of the photographs are most likely fake, but even today, photographs of this thing continue to pop up on the internet, and folks, no one can figure out what this thing is. Now, what's really weird is in 2008, a photo taken with Google Earth revealed something odd. Researchers who discovered this photo believe it to show the infamous Ningen. Of course, officials were quick to just deem it nothing more than an iceberg, and yeah, that's of course a possibility, but if it was a Ningen, do you think the officials would admit to it? Probably not. Otherwise, you'd be talking about a major scientific breakthrough, right? Unfortunately, these things will probably never be revealed to the public, and it's very possible that as we moved into the last 30-40 years, that more documentation will prove that something beyond the norm does exist. For now, it just remains a mystery. Footage taken from a 2010 chemical company out of Japan that was conducting underwater surveillance captured something bizarre. Many were quick to point out that this is nothing abnormal at all and can easily be dismissed as a snaggle-toothed snake eel. I mean, sure, there are similarities, but the head and face are different. Plus, we don't have great context of the perspective in this footage. The truly interesting part is that there are more videos like this one that honestly leaves a lot of people scratching their heads, grasping at straws for answers because simply there are none. Now, of course, it could be fake, but assuming it's real, don't you see what looks like a pair of arms and what might be a stumpy head? I mean, I have no idea what lives in the ocean that looks like that. At least, nothing we've discovered as of today. If we assume it's fake, then the bad quality could easily cover up for the CGI, and not to mention its unnecessarily short duration. At this point, we've looked at a lot of things that these things are not, but could there perhaps be some rational explanation for them? Well, one idea that's been tossed around is that the Ningen might be a previously unknown species of giant ray. And when I say giant ray, I mean massive. We're talking a ray that's been supersized to an almost unbelievable degree, but how could a creature that big go unnoticed for so long, especially in the modern era? It is a fair question, but some scientists have suggested that we've only cataloged about 20% of all the species in the world's oceans. That's a lot of uncharted territory, and it leaves plenty of room for something like a giant ray to hide out, especially if it primarily sticks to the icy waters of the Antarctic. So, could a huge albino ray have evolved to blend in with the floating icebergs and frozen debris of its chilly home? I mean, it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility, and if such a creature did exist, it's easy to see how it might be mistaken for something more fantastical like a humanoid sea monster. But here's the thing, even if we allow for the existence of a giant albino ray, it's still a stretch to get from there to the Ningen. As it's been described, I mean, we're talking about a creature with a distinctly humanoid shape, complete with arms, legs, and even facial features. I'm going to go out on a whim here and suggest something more on the paranormal nature. Demons. Yes, you heard me right. Let me explain. Now, Japanese folklore is absolutely brimming with all sorts of incredible creatures, many of which fall under the category of yokai. These are mystical entities that often have animal-like features. You've got the kappa, which looks like a turtle-shelled primate, and the baku, which resembles a strange elephant-like creature. The list goes on and on. I mean, I know it sounds far-fetched, but in the grand scheme of things, is it really that much stranger than the idea of a giant humanoid sea creature? And let's not forget that Japan has a rich history of supernatural beliefs and encounters. From vengeful spirits to shape-shifting foxes, the paranormal is deeply ingrained in Japanese culture. So, is it really that much of a stretch to think that the Ningen might be another manifestation of this fascination with the otherworldly? Or what if they aren't biological or paranormal? What if they're mechanical? USOs, or unidentified submersible objects, are underwater versions of the UFOs. Now, these strange vehicles are said to be able to soar through the air and plunge into the depths of the ocean with equal ease. And get this, even Christopher Columbus reported seeing them, and sightings have continued to this day. Now, most people assume that USOs are some kind of highly advanced technology, either from another world or created by an underwater civilization that's way more advanced than we are. But what if we've got it all wrong? What if these objects aren't vehicles at all, but actually living creatures? I mean, think about it. The Ningen, with their oddly shaped bodies and stiff, almost mechanical movements, could easily be mistaken for some kind of underwater craft. What if they're the real USOs? And all these sightings of supposed submersible vehicles are actually just glimpses of these bizarre creatures. In the videos that supposedly show these creatures, they move so stiffly and mechanically. It's a wild theory, but in actuality, we don't know. Now, that brings us to our last possible conclusion. Aliens. The guy from Ancient Aliens had it right all along, if you consider all the incredible diverse forms of life we have right here on Earth. So the idea of aliens coming in a wild array of shapes and sizes doesn't seem so far-fetched anymore. I mean, if aliens visit here, is it possible that some could or would be aquatic? Now, what I find fascinating is that we as humans, we have this inherent bias towards terrestrial life. We live on land, so we assume that's the norm, but the truth is, we're actually the minority when it comes to life on Earth. The vast majority of creatures on this planet call the water home. So if some cosmic species was attracted to our world, maybe they'd be looking for a nice place to settle down below. And let's face it, the Earth has water in spades. Now, obviously, these are nothing more than theories because, like I've said, sometimes you have to be willing to entertain even the most outlandish possibilities, because you never know where the truth might lie. So far, all of the water giants that we've discussed have been confined to the ocean, especially the regions around the planet's poles and the waters of the South Pacific. But did you know that the waterways of America sometimes hold gigantic aquatic humanoids as well? Near Chaleur in New Brunswick, the local Micmac nation once feared a creature that they referred to as the Gugu, a creature said to patrol the waters around not only New Brunswick, but Nova Scotia as well. It appears several times in the writings of early French explorer Samuel de Champlain, who charted some of Canada's northern waterways. Tribal wisdom describes the Gugu as having big hands and the hairy face of a bear, but with flat, no long snout and no visible ears. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should. Many cryptozoologists today connect the Gugu to none other than Bigfoot. But there's one important difference. The Gugu is said to be really fond of water. While there have been plenty of stories featuring Bigfoot swimming, the Gugu seems different. Explorers talking to the Micmac learned that, in no uncertain terms, the Gugu was, and I quote, certainly amphibious, implying that it didn't just swim in water occasionally, it spent a lot of time there. It was said that the Gugu waded in the water, ready to devour passing ships in a single bite. And the Gugu is also said to be incredibly tall, much taller than your typical Bigfoot. There are references to the beast being a fearful monster in the shape of a woman as tall as the mast of a ship. Interesting description. So, in Canada, we have something that sounds really similar to the Cabagon and the Ningen, a gigantic humanoid that lives in the water. Is this a coincidence or something more? Now, one of the earliest recorded descriptions of the Gugu comes directly from Samuel de Champlain himself. Although he used a lot of outdated language, it still makes for an interesting read. Champlain wrote this.
There is one strange thing worthy of an account, which many savages have assured me was true. That is, that near the Bay of Heat, toward the south, there is an island where a frightful monster makes his home, which the savages call Gugu. It had the form of a woman, but very terrible, and such a size that they told me the tops of the masts of our vessel would not reach to his waist. So great do they represent him, and they say that he is often eaten up and still continues to eat up many savages. These he puts, when he can catch them, into a great pocket, and afterwards he eats them. And those who had escaped the danger of this awful beast said that its pocket was so great that it could have put our vessels into it. This monster makes horrible noises on this island, and when they speak of it, it is with unutterable fear, and several have assured me that they have seen him. While going in search of mines, one man passed so near the haunt of this terrible beast that he and all those on board his vessel heard strange hissings from the noise she made, and the savages with him told him it was the same creature, and they were so afraid that they hid themselves wherever they could for fear that she would come and carry them off.
Did you catch that? Remember, Champlain said that the supposed pocket on the Gugu was big enough to fit an entire ship. To me, this sounds less like a Bigfoot and more like one of those giant ocean humanoids that we've been talking about. One Micmac story emphasizes the sheer size of this Micmac water monster. In his book, On the Trail of Elder Brother, Michael B. Runningwolf collected indigenous stories of the Glooscap, a folk hero said to be the embodiment of the Great Spirit. Well, one of these stories finds Glooscap investigating a stream that has run dry, and he follows it to a camp where strange people with webbed hands and feet tell him that the water is being controlled by their chief. If the stream has any chance of being restored, Glooscap would have to ask permission from this creature. Here's Michael's description of the chief of the web-handed people.
This creature was as big as a mountain, with a grinning mouth that stretched a mile from ear to ear. His yellow eyes stared out his head like two enormous pine knots. His swollen body was covered with ugly warts. This creature had made himself a huge burrow at the source of the stream and dammed it all up to create a great reservoir. Now, almost no water made its way to the stream bed. He had also fouled the reservoir and made it so poisonous that fetid mists hung above its oily surface.
Now, as the story goes, Glooscap tricked the monster into trying to eat him. When it tried, Glooscap grew to the size of the tallest pine tree, essentially locking the monster's mouth open. He then slashed at the creature, releasing all the water it had stolen, saving his people. So, what do you think? The Kabagon, the Ningen, and the Gugu, they all sound like they're describing the same thing, or at least something similar. Is it a coincidence that we have two sets of tales from halfway across the globe, Japan and Canada, that describe gigantic humanoids living in the water? Or is there something more to these stories? Could it just be that there are giants living in the dark depths of our ocean, beings that are not just simple animals, but have their own intelligence? And are the governments of the world hiding this secret? Well, let me know what you think down below. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to comment below, will we ever know the truth? So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy these kinds of deep dives into these strange, perplexing mysteries, what are you waiting for? Slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. And remember, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.